Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that twist the mundane into the absurd, consider subscribing to At Nightfall Notions for more stories that lull you into curiosity rather than sleep. Tonight's offering is a sip of sacrilege, a gulp of guilt, and a barrel of trouble. Chapter 1. The Sacred Cellar. You are Brother Theodoric, though no one has called you by your name in years. Here, in the Monastery of St. Drogo, the Unblinking, you are simply the Wine Monk, a title as thrilling as watching moss grow on a gravestone. Your duty is to guard the sacred wine, a vintage so holy it's said to have been blessed by a saint who hated parties. The cellar is your kingdom, a damp, cobwebbed realm where the only subjects are barrels and your own creeping despair. Tonight, like every night, you descend the narrow stairs, your sandals whispering against the stone. The abbot's words echo in your head, not a drop touched, not a sip sampled, lest the wrath of heaven and the abbot's ledger fall upon you. The wine is for holy days, for visiting bishops, for miracles that haven't happened since the year a goat was elected mayor. It is not for you. But tonight is different. Tonight, the cellar is colder, the shadows longer. Perhaps it's the way the torchlight flickers, making the barrels seem to lean in, whispering. Or perhaps it's the weight of your boredom, a burden heavier than the vow of silence you broke last week by screaming into a loaf of bread. You run a hand along the nearest cask, the wood smooth under your fingers. The temptation is a quiet, insistent thing, like a mouse nibbling at your resolve. One sip, just one, to see what all the fuss is about. You tell yourself it's scholarly curiosity, a theological inquiry into the divine bouquet. The bung comes loose with a soft pop, and the smell hits you dark like figs and forgiveness. You dip a finger, taste it. The world tilts. It's like drinking sunlight filtered through stained glass, like swallowing a hymn. You take another sip, then another. Time blurs. The torch burns low. You realize with a slow, wine-soaked dread that the cask is empty. All of it. Gone. You stare at the barrel, then at your hands, which are now the hands of a heretic. Panic arrives, sharp and sobering. The abbot will notice. The abbot always notices. You consider prayer, but even God might laugh at this. Then comes the sound, a creak from above. Footsteps. Someone is coming. You have the stillness of a man who has just swallowed his own doom. The wine, now a warm glow in your belly, whispers a single treacherous thought. What if you drank the other barrels too? The footsteps grow closer. The cellar door groans. A shadow falls across the stairs. You have exactly one breath to decide whether to confess, to flee, or to embrace damnation and start uncorking the next cask. The torch sputters. The choice is yours. Chapter 2. A Sip of Curiosity. The first taste had been an accident, if such a thing could ever truly be accidental. A moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, a finger dipped into the forbidden nectar. Call it what you will, but the deed was done. The second taste, however, was deliberate. It was a choice. And choices, as every monk knows, are the difference between a sin and a habit. The wine was unlike anything you had ever tasted. Monastic life had afforded you many pleasures, if one could call stale bread, lukewarm broth, and the occasional hymn sung slightly off-key pleasures. But this was different. It was rich and velvety, with notes of dark fruit and something indefinable, something that lingered on the tongue like a secret. The sacred wine was not merely drinkable, it was ate goody. It was, you realized with a slow dawning horror. You had heard the stories, of course. The wine was said to have been blessed by St. Drogo himself. A man so austere he once fasted for 40 days just to prove a point to a particularly irritating sparrow. It was reserved for miracles, for divine visitations, for moments when the heavens deigned to notice the monastery. It was not, by any stretch of theological reasoning, meant for a lowly monk with an aching back and a growing sense that life had more to offer than candle polishing and self-reproach. Yet here you were, sipping it like a king at a banquet. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the barrels like disapproving specters. You could almost hear the voices of the long-dead brothers, their whispers curling around you like smoke. "Theodoric, what have you done?" "But..." The wine, warm in your belly, had a way of quieting such concerns. It murmured back, soft and persuasive, "What does it matter? Who will know? Honesty? Unsendendamen. You took another sip. Then another. The world softened at the edges, the cellar walls seeming to breathe in and out with the rhythm of your own chest. The weight of your vows, the endless cycle of prayers and penances, the way Brother Anselm always chewed his food like a man trying to punish it, all of it faded into the background. For the first time in years, you felt something dangerously close to contentment. Then came the sound. A footstep on the stair. A rustle of robes. Someone was coming. Your heart, which had been floating somewhere near your collarbone, plummeted into your sandals. The abbot, Brother Cellar, with his unnerving ability to sense a missing crust of bread from 3 corridors away? Or worse, Brother Elias, the monastery's self-appointed enforcer of piety, who had once lectured a spider for spinning its web too wantonly. You had mere seconds to decide: hide, confess, or brazen it out. The empty cask beside you seemed to mock your predicament. There was no undoing what had been done. The footsteps paused. A shadow stretched across the cellar floor. You took one last defiant sip. If this was damnation, it tasted suspiciously like redemption. Chapter 3. The barrel runs dry. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to slice with a knife, if one had been foolish enough to bring a knife into a sacred wine cellar, which at this point seemed no more reckless than what you had just done. You stared at the empty barrel. It gaped back at you like the mouth of a sinner at confession, hollow and waiting to be filled with excuses. The last drops of sacred wine clung stubbornly to the wood, reluctant to abandon their home, much like you were now reluctant to abandon this cellar and face the consequences of your thirst. The torchlight flickered, casting long, accusatory shadows. The air smelled of damp stone, old oak, and the faintest trace of your impending doom. You had not set out to commit sacrilege. You had merely been curious, then thirsty. Then, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th sip, you had become something far worse, a man who had finished the job. And the footsteps resumed closer now. You recognized the slow, deliberate tread. Brother Cellarer, the monastery's keeper of keys and accounts, a man so precise he could tell you how many peas were in last Tuesday's soup without needing to count. If anyone would notice a missing barrel of sacred wine, it was him. If anyone could calculate the exact number of lashes required for such a transgression, it was also him. Your mind raced through possibilities. You could claim a miracle. Perhaps the wine had evaporated in a fit of divine whimsy. You could blame a rat, though you doubted even the most gluttonous rodent could explain this level of depletion. You could feign ignorance, but your face had never been particularly cooperative in the art of deception. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Brother Cellarer's thin frame appeared in the archway, his expression one of perpetual mild disapproval. His eyes, sharp as a tax collector's quill, scanned the cellar before landing on you. Then the barrel. Then the guilty tilt of your shoulders. "Brother Theodoric," he said, in a tone that suggested he had already begun drafting the report of your demise. You swallowed. "Brother Cellarer." A pause. The kind of pause that could stretch into eternity if left unattended. He stepped forward, his sandals whispering against the stone. His gaze flicked to the empty cask, then back to you. "The wine," he said. "Yes. It's gone." "Yes. All of it." You considered lying. You considered running. You considered the very real possibility that you might now have to join a traveling circus, as the drunken monk seemed your only viable career path. Instead, you did what any man caught in the act would do. You gestured vaguely at the barrel and said, "It was an accident." Brother Cellar's eyebrow arched. "An accident? Ah, theological accident." He sighed, a sound that carried the weight of ledgers and lost patience. "Brother Theodoric, do you know how many years it takes to produce a single barrel of this wine?" You did not. 12, he said. 12 years of pressing, fermenting, blessing, and waiting. 12 years of monks praying over it, of bishops ignoring it, of mice trying and failing to breach it. And in one evening you have reduced it to, he peered into the barrel, an empty husk. You had no defense. The wine had been too good, the night too long, your willpower too weak. You looked down at your hands, half expecting them to be stained purple with guilt. Brother Cellar folded his arms. "The abbot will hear of this." You nodded. Of course he would. The abbot heard everything, eventually. He was like God in that way, except slightly more likely to assign you extra chores. But then Brother Cellar did something unexpected. He sighed again, deeper this time, and rubbed his temples. "Though," he muttered, "I suppose I could delay my report until tomorrow." You blinked. "You could." "I could." He gave you a look that was almost sympathetic. After all, even the holiest of wines is still just wine. And a man who drinks an entire barrel of it in one sitting is either a sinner or a man who desperately needed a drink. You weren't sure which category you fell into, but you were grateful all the same. Brother Cellar turned to leave, then paused at the stairs. "One more thing," he said. "Yes. If the abbot asks, the rats were very large." And with that he disappeared up the stairs, leaving you alone with your empty barrel and the dawning realization that you might just survive the night. Of course, there was still the matter of the other barrels, and the fact that you were now technically a wine thief, and the distinct possibility that St. Drogo himself might take offense. But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, you had a new mission, figuring out how to sleep off a divine hangover. Chapter 4. Divine Intoxication. The wine's warmth had settled into your bones like a lazy cat claiming the best spot by the fire, comfortable, possessive, and utterly unmovable. At first it had been pleasant, a golden hum beneath your skin. Now it was something else entirely. The cellar walls pulsed gently, breathing in time with your heartbeat, while the torchlight stretched and twisted like taffy pulled by invisible hands. You had drunk wine before, of course. Watered-down table wine that tasted more of vinegar than grapes. But this was different. This was drinking a psalm and feeling it sing in your veins. Then the visions began. At first you thought it was just the shadows playing tricks, a flicker of movement near the far barrels, a whisper that wasn't quite the creak of aging wood. But then St. Drogo himself materialized beside you, translucent as old parchment and smelling faintly of damp wool and disappointment. His eyebrows, always his most expressive feature, arched toward heaven in theatrical dismay. 12 years, the spectre intoned, his voice the sound of a damp log sputtering in a fire. 12 years of patient aging, and you drain it in one evening like a peasant at a tavern. You opened your mouth to protest, but your tongue felt 3 sizes too large. The saint sighed, the gust of it stirring the cobwebs overhead. She supposed it could be worse. At least you didn't mix it with cheese. You had no idea what that meant, but before you could ask, the vision shifted. Now the cellar was crowded with figures, saints and sinners jostling for space between the barrels. There was Brother Anselm's great-uncle, a notorious baker who had once been excommunicated for hiding raisins in Lenten bread. A trio of martyrs comparing wound placements like competitive gardeners, and a very small demon perched on a cask, nibbling idly on a communion wafer. "Kay never give us the good wafers upstairs," the demon confided, crumbs tumbling down its chin. "Always the stale ones. It's like they want us to rebel." You blinked, and suddenly you were no longer in the cellar but standing in the monastery's herb garden, except the herbs were singing a rather off-key rendition of Wavani Creator Spiritus, and the moon had too many faces, all of them judging you. The rosemary bush leaned close, its scent sharp as a lecturing finger. "You really should have stopped at the first sip," it whispered. "Or at least shared. Back in the cellar, or were you still there?" The wine barrels had grown legs, and were doing a slow waltz around the room, their staves creaking in protest. The largest one paused before you and burped a cloud of fragrant purple vapor that smelled like regret and blackberries. Somewhere beyond the haze, a bell tolled. Matinstunden, the night office. Which meant the brothers would be rising soon, which meant someone might come looking for you, which meant a cold splash of panic cut through the wine's warmth. You were drunk. Not tipsy, not merry, but disgracefully drunk. On sacred wine. In the sacred cellar. With what appeared to be a choir of very disappointed ancestral monks now harmonizing near the pickling jars. The smallest vision, a cherub with the face of Brother Cellarer, tugged at your sleeve. "You should probably sleep it off," it advised. "Preferably somewhere they won't find you curled around a barrel like a lovesick tavern wench." This seemed like excellent advice. You attempted to stand, discovered your legs had turned to overcooked noodles, and settled for crawling toward the stairs. Behind you the saints resumed their bickering over whether gluttony was worse than sloth, the general consensus, only if you did it lazily. The torch sputtered out as you reached the first step, plunging the cellar into darkness, save for the faint glow of the demon's snack. Somehow, through divine intervention or sheer dumb luck, you made it to your cell. Your palate had never looked so welcoming. As you collapsed onto it, the wall still gently undulating, your last coherent thought was that tomorrow's penance would be legendary. Then the ceiling opened like a flower, and you fell into a dream where the abbot was made of cheese and kept forgiving you in increasingly elaborate rhymes. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 5. The abbot's suspicion. Morning light came like a punishment. The bell for Priam rang with the subtlety of a hammer to the skull, each reverberation sending fresh waves of agony through your wine-addled brain. You had once heard a traveling physician describe the torments of hell as eternal fire and gnashing of teeth, but you now knew the truth. Hell was a hangover in a monastery where no one was allowed to speak below a joyful shout. Somehow you managed to rise, your body protesting as though you'd spent the night being trampled by runaway goats. Your mouth tasted like a sinner's last confession, dry and full of regret. The ghost of St. Drogo's disappointed face still lingered in your memory, though whether it had been real or imagined, you couldn't say. Nor did you particularly wish to know. You stumbled into the cloister, squinting against the cruel sunlight. The brothers were assembling for the morning office, their faces creased with their usual expressions of mild suffering. Normally you blended right in, but today your steps were too light, your expression too content. The sacred wine may have left you with a head full of hammers, but it had also left something else, an unshakable sense of warmth, as though you'd swallowed a tiny sun and it had decided to take up residence behind your ribs. This, it turned out, was your undoing. Vespers found you humming under your breath, a slight smile tugging at your lips as you remembered the way the wine barrels had waltzed. You were halfway through the Magnificat before you noticed the weight of eyes upon you. There, in his carved stall, sat Abbot Jerome, his gaze sharp enough to slice through your fragile veneer of piety. His eyebrows, legendary in their expressiveness, had crept upward like two skeptical caterpillars attempting to summit his forehead. You swallowed, your throat suddenly dry. The abbot's stare was the sort that could peel paint from walls and lies from lips. You tried to school your features into something appropriately monastic, a blend of reverence and mild constipation. But the damage was done. His eyes narrowed, and in that moment you knew. He suspected. The service ended with agonizing slowness. As the brothers filed out, you lingered, pretending sudden fascination with a loose thread on your sleeve. The abbot lingered too, fussing with his breviary in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world to wait you out. The game was up. You could either bolt like a startled hare, or face your doom with whatever dignity remained to you. Given that your current dignity level hovered somewhere between disgraced court jester and damp sack of turnips, neither option seemed particularly appealing. Brother Theodoric. The abbot's voice was deceptively mild, the verbal equivalent of a velvet-wrapped brick. A word. You followed him to his study, the walk feeling eerily similar to your childhood memory of being led to the woodshed. His quarters were sparse, dominated by a massive desk that had allegedly been carved from a single tree struck by lightning during a particularly moving sermon. The air smelled of beeswax, parchment, and quiet judgment. The abbot settled into his chair, steepling his fingers. You seem cheerful today. You opened your mouth, closed it, then opted for the safest response known to monks since time immemorial, a non-committal hum. He leaned forward slightly, unusually so. A bead of sweat traced a treacherous path down your spine. You could confess. You could throw yourself on his mercy. You could explain that the wine had been calling to you in iambic pentameter, and you'd merely been trying to quiet the voices. Instead, you heard yourself say, "The Lord's love is a perpetual delight, Father." The abbot's left eyelid twitched. Indeed. He reached into his desk and produced a small ledger, flipping it open with practiced ease. Brother Cellarer reports an irregularity in the wine cellar. Dart. Your stomach attempted to climb into your throat. Oh? Domzin. His finger trailed down a column of numbers. It seems one of the blessed casks is empty. He looked up, his expression as innocent as a fox outside a henhouse. Would you know anything about that? The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. The sound was obscenely cheerful, given the circumstances. You were considering the merits of fainting when salvation arrived in the form of a commotion outside. Shouting? The unmistakable clatter of dropped cookware. The abbot's attention wavered, and you nearly wept with relief. Brother Elias burst in, his face flushed. "Father Abbot! The goats are in the vestry again." The abbot sighed the sigh of a man who had long ago accepted that his life would be an endless procession of minor calamities. He rose, pausing only to give you one last lingering look. "We will continue this conversation later." As he swept out, you slumped into the nearest chair, your legs refusing to hold you any longer. The reprieve was temporary, you knew that. But for now, you were safe. And if your hands still smelled faintly of stolen wine, well, that was between you and the goats. Chapter 6. A Monk's Guilt. Guilt, you were discovering, was a peculiar thing. It gnawed at you during morning prayers, nipped at your heels in the cloister, and perched like a judgmental crow on your shoulder during meals. Every sip of water tasted like theft, every crust of bread like sacrilege. The empty barrel haunted you more effectively than any ghost. At least spirits had the decency to only appear at night. But alongside the guilt came something else, the dawning realization of how absurd it all was. You, Brother Theodoric, a man whose greatest rebellion had previously been sneaking an extra spoonful of honey into your porridge, had single-handedly drained a barrel of the monastery's most sacred wine. Not sipped. not sampled, or drained. You're like some back-alley drunkard rather than a man of God. The sheer ridiculousness of it kept bubbling up at inappropriate moments, threatening to turn your guilty grimace into something far more dangerous. Laughter. You were kneading dough in the bakery when it first struck you. The yeasty smell of rising bread, the rhythmic thump of your fists against the dough, it was all so normal, so mundane. And yet, beneath your fingernails lurked the faintest purple stain from the wine cask. A monk's hands were supposed to bear the marks of labor, the calluses of devotion, not evidence of holy theft. The contrast was so ludicrous you nearly choked on your own spit trying to suppress a giggle. Brother Anselm glanced up from his own loaf, his forehead creasing. You're smiling. You schooled your features into what you hoped passed for solemnity. Just, contemplating the miracle of bread. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his kneading. You exhaled slowly. It was a near thing. The guilt returned in waves throughout the day, each ebb followed by a fresh surge of absurdity. During chapter meeting, as Brother Cellarer droned on about the dwindling honey reserves, you found yourself wondering whether the sacred wine had actually been that good, or if you'd just been desperate for something to break the monotony. The thought alone was blasphemous enough to make your toes curl in your sandals. Then came Vespers, and with it, a new horror. The abbot had not forgotten your earlier conversation. That much was clear from the way his gaze lingered on you during the hymns. You kept your eyes firmly on your psalter, chanting with all the fervor of a man, trying to outrun his own conscience. But when the time came for the final blessing, something extraordinary happened. As the abbot raised his hands, a shaft of late afternoon sunlight struck the stained glass window above him, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the floor. A collective sigh rose from the brothers. Even you, guilty as you were, felt a prickle of awe. Then the abbot sneezed. The moment shattered. The brothers coughed and shifted. Someone's stomach growled audibly. The ordinary mundanity of it all, the human absurdity, hit you like a revelation. Here you were, surrounded by men who had devoted their lives to the divine, and yet the most miraculous thing to happen today had been Brother Elias managing to go a full hour without dropping something. The walk back to your cell was accompanied by a growing sense of clarity. You had sinned, yes, but was it truly so terrible? The wine had been meant for holy occasions, but what was holier than joy? Then in feeling something beyond the daily grind of prayers and chores. A dangerous thought followed. What if the wine had been meant for you all along? You paused outside your cell, the weight of the idea settling over you. What if this was your miracle? Not levitation or stigmata or any of the showy tricks the more famous saints had performed, but something quieter. Something that tasted of figs and forgiveness and left your soul lighter than it had been in years. The guilt was still there, but it no longer felt like a millstone around your neck. It felt like the natural companion to having done something alive. One din external pendite. You pushed open your cell door, half expecting to find Saint Drogo waiting with another lecture. Instead, there was only your pallet, your prayer stool, and the quiet hum of the monastery settling in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated. You smiled. Tomorrow would bring what it would. The abbot's wrath, your penance, perhaps even another barrel to guard. But for tonight, you had your miracle. And it had been delicious. Chapter 7. The Confession. 3 days had passed since the incident with the wine, and the weight of your unconfessed sin had begun to take on physical dimensions. Pressed against your ribs when you breathed, made your knees ache during prayers, and gave your tonsure an itchy quality that no amount of scratching could relieve. Even Brother Anselm had noticed your discomfort, though he attributed it to bad humors and suggested bleeding you with leeches, a remedy you politely declined while backing slowly away. The time had come to confess. You chose the hour before compline, when the shadows in the chapel were longest, and the confessional booth smelled least of mildew. The wooden seat creaked under you as you knelt, and the lattice screen separating you from Father Abbot's ear seemed suddenly far too flimsy a barrier against divine judgment. A soft clearing of throat came from the other side. You swallowed. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The abbot's silhouette shifted. "Go on." Here it was, your moment of contrition. The words had been rehearsed in your head a dozen times. A humble admission of guilt, a plea for mercy. Perhaps a carefully worded suggestion that the wine had been so holy, it had practically poured itself down your throat. But what came out instead was, it was really good. Silence, Doy. You blinked. That had not been the plan. The abbot's voice was measured. What was? The wine. The words tumbled out now, unstoppable as a tipped cask. I mean, obviously, it was wrong to drink it. Very wrong. But have you ever tasted it, Father? It's like drinking sunlight that's been filtered through a choir of angels. If angels were made of plums, and maybe a little oak, with just the faintest hint of Brother Theodoric, you froze. The abbot exhaled loudly enough to stir the dust motes in the air. Are you attempting to confess or review a vintage? Your mouth opened and closed. Confess. Then confess. You tried again. I drank the sacred wine, all of it, and I'd do it again. Another silence, this one heavier. Your brain, sensing imminent disaster, helpfully supplied, not that I would do it again. Obviously. Unless, no. Definitely not. The abbot's fingers appeared on the lattice, tapping once. 12 years, he said quietly. 12 years that wine aged in the cellar, blessed by 3 bishops, reserved for miracles. Your guilt returned in a rush. I know. And you drank it because? Here, at least you had an honest answer. Because I was curious what a miracle tasted like. The booth creaked as the abbot leaned back. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant murmur of brothers preparing for compline. Then, to your utter shock, a soft snort came from the other side of the screen. You're not the first, he said at last. You blinked. I'm not. Brother Elias got into the sacramental wine last Pentecost. Claimed he was testing it for poison. And before that, Brother Anselm, in 42, said he mistook it for cough syrup. A weight lifted from your chest. What did you do to them? The abbot sighed. Made them polish every candlestick in the chapel, twice. You could live with that. Candlesticks were nothing compared to the visions of eternal damnation that had haunted your dreams. But then the abbot continued. Of course they only had a ye glassy, each. Your stomach dropped. The lattice slid aside abruptly, revealing the abbot's face in the dim light. His expression was unreadable. Oh, whole barrel, Theodoric. You braced for the wrath, the penance, the inevitable decree that you would spend the rest of your days scrubbing the privy with your own toothbrush. Instead, the abbot leaned closer. Describe it again. You stared. What? The taste. In detail. And so you did. The rich darkness of it, the way it had warmed you from the inside out, the inexplicable hint of something that might have been cinnamon or might have been grace. The abbot listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin. When you finished, he nodded once. Brother Cellarer mentioned the empty cask. You winced. He also mentioned, the abbot continued, that we have 6 more just like it. Your breath caught. The abbot stood, his robes whispering against the wood. Your penance begins tomorrow. For now. He paused at the curtain. Try to get through compline without grinning. As his footsteps faded, you realized 2 things. First, you were perhaps not as doomed as you'd thought. Second, and more troubling, the monastery's wine supply was now in greater danger than ever. From you. From the abbot. And you suspected, from the sudden gleam in Brother Cellar's eye when he'd spoken of those remaining casks. The bell for compline rang, calling the brothers to prayer. You rose from the confessional, your step lighter than it had been in days. Somewhere in the dark, a mouse skittered across the flagstones. You smiled. Miracles, it seemed, came in many forms. Chapter 8. The monastery's secret. Penance, you discovered, took many forms. Yours involved scrubbing the refectory floor with a brush so small it might have been designed for mice, with particularly delicate paws. The abbot had declared this punishment fitting. Let the hands that stole wine toil in the place where bread is broken. And so here you knelt, your knees protesting against the cold stone, your back aching as you scraped away at a particularly stubborn stain that looked suspiciously like Brother Elias had attempted to paint a self-portrait in gravy. The other brothers passed by in silent procession, their sandals whispering against the half-damp floor. Some offered sympathetic nods. Others, particularly those who had never risked anything more scandalous than an extra blanket in winter, eyed you with the quiet horror usually reserved for heretics and men who put milk in before tea. Then Brother Thaddeus shuffled in. At 97, Brother Thaddeus was the monastery's oldest resident and its unofficial keeper of secrets. He moved like a parchment left too long in the sun, brittle, yellowed, and prone to crackling at unexpected moments. Normally he spent his days dozing in the cloister garden, occasionally waking to deliver cryptic pronouncements about the weather or the state of his knees. Today, however, his milky eyes were alert as he settled onto a bench beside you. You drank the wine, he said. You froze mid-scrub. How did you? He waved a gnarled hand. The walls talk, boy. So do the casks, especially when they're empty. You resumed scrubbing, though your motions were now distracted. I suppose everyone knows. Everyone who matters. He leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of mint and mildew. Do you know why that wine was sacred? You hesitated. Because it was blessed? Thaddeus snorted, a sound like dry leaves caught in a gust. Blessed? Ha! That wine wasn't for God. It was for you, see. You blinked. First Abbot, old Drogo's successor, had a problem, he continued, lowering his voice. Monks kept quiet thinking, asking questions, wondering why the roof leaked, or why we ate porridge every damn day. So he had the wine made. Special recipe. Just a drop in the communion cup every Sunday, enough to keep everyone quiet and content. Your scrub brush slipped from your fingers. Thaddeus nodded at your expression. Oh yes, centuries of obedience, all thanks to a well-timed sip. Until the bishops caught wind and declared it too effective. Said it wasn't piety if the monks were too pickled to protest. So the casks got locked away, only to be used on holy days when visitors needed impressing. His grin revealed 3 remaining teeth, and now you've gone and drunk an entire barrel of it. The implication settled over you like a moldy cloak. The warmth in your veins. The visions. The sudden, unshakable certainty that Brother Elias's singing Rashald be met with thrown vegetables. You had not just consumed wine. You had drunk centuries of suppressed rebellion. Thaddeus patted your shoulder. Don't look so grim. Might do us all some good. He gestured to the far wall, where a faded fresco depicted Saint Drogo frowning at a loaf of bread. Even saints get cranky when they're hungry. You opened your mouth to reply, but a commotion from the courtyard cut you off. Raised voices. The unmistakable sound of something wooden, splintering. Thaddeus' grin widened. Ah, right on time. You scrambled to your feet just as Brother Cellar burst in, his robe askew, his face flushed. The goats, he panted. They're in the wine cellar. A beat of silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the monastery, came the distinct sound of a barrel rolling. Then another. And then, faint but unmistakable, the joyous bleating of a goat who had just discovered liquid salvation. Thaddeus cackled. You stared at the chaos unfolding, the brush forgotten in your hand. Somewhere in your chest, the wine's warmth pulsed, not with guilt now, but with something dangerously like possibility. The abbot appeared in the doorway, his robes flapping. His gaze locked onto yours. For a moment, neither of you moved. Then, very slowly, he raised a brow. You raised one back. The monastery would never be the same. Chapter 9. The rebellion begins. The chaos in the wine cellar proved impossible to contain, both literally and figuratively. By the time you arrived, the scene resembled a particularly unholy festival. Brother Elias stood atop an overturned barrel, conducting an impromptu choir of goats with a stolen ladle. Brother Anselm had somehow acquired a wineskin and was demonstrating with alarming enthusiasm why he should never have been allowed to dance. And Brother Cellar, the man who had spent decades meticulously tracking every grain of salt in the monastery stores, was laughing so hard he had to brace himself against a wall. The sacred wine was everywhere. In cups, in puddles, in the beard of a goat that looked disturbingly pleased with itself. You turned to the abbot, expecting thunder. Instead, you found him surveying the scene with an expression you couldn't quite place. Not anger. Not even resignation. Something closer to relief. Then he reached past you, grabbed a jug, and took a long, deliberate swig. The effect was instantaneous. The monks froze. The goats, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, paused mid-chew. Even the candles seemed to burn brighter, as though awaiting a proclamation. The abbot wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Brother Theodoric," he said, his voice carrying over the silence. "You were about to say something about the vow of silence?" The warmth in your chest flared. It wasn't just the wine now. It was the collective weight of decades of unsaid words pressing against the dam of tradition. You climbed onto the nearest intact barrel, ignoring the way it sloshed ominously beneath you, and took a breath. "It's nonsense," you declared. A gasp rippled through the room. Even the goats looked scandalized. You pressed on. "We spend our lives whispering like guilty schoolboys, when half of us haven't done anything worth repenting for. Brother Anselm hums in his sleep. Brother Elias talks to his spoon. And don't even get me started on Brother Cellar's ledger commentary." Brother Cellar flushed, but didn't deny it. "The rule was written centuries ago," you continued, "by men who thought holiness lived in the space between words. But what if it lives in the words themselves? What if—" You were interrupted by Brother Thaddeus, who chose that moment to sneeze with such force that his hood flew backward. "Sorry," he rasped. "Go on. What if we've been quiet for so long we've forgotten how to listen?" The words hung in the air, thick as incense. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. "I've always hated Gregorian chant," ventured Brother Anselm. "The porridge is terrible," added Brother Elias. "The vestments itch. The bells are too loud at dawn. The goats are better company than half the brothers." The floodgates were open. Decades of petty grievances, creative insults, and profoundly unmonastic opinions spilled forth. Someone suggested adding honey to the communion bread. Someone else proposed a monastery-wide siesta. Brother Cellar, emboldened by wine and the sudden absence of consequences, announced that he had been fudging the ledgers for years to hide his personal stash of dried apricots. Through it all, the abbot stood silent, his expression unreadable. Then, just as the clamor reached its peak, he raised a hand. The room fell quiet. He took another sip from the jug, then set it down with deliberate care. "The vow of silence," he said slowly, "was instituted in 1123, after Brother Morris wouldn't stop singing." A beat. Then from the back of the room, Brother Thaddeus cackled. I remember that dreadful voice, like a cat in a threshing machine. The abbot's lips twitched. The rule has served its purpose, but perhaps—" He trailed off, his gaze sweeping the room. Over the flushed faces, the wine-stained robes, the goat now attempting to climb onto the abbot's chair. Perhaps it's time we remembered how to use our voices. The cheer that followed shook dust from the rafters. Somewhere in the pandemonium you caught the abbot's eye. He raised his jug in a silent toast. You raised yours in return. The rebellion, it seemed, had begun, and not a moment too soon. Chapter 10. The Abbot's Wrath. The rebellion lasted exactly 37 hours. It ended the moment the wine ran out. Without the sacred vintage coursing through their veins, the monks quickly reverted to form. Brother Elias dropped his spoon mid-rant about kitchen reforms and immediately fled to his cell to repent. Brother Anselm woke from his apricot-fueled haze with a start, clutched his head, and began reciting psalms at double speed. Even Brother Cellarer, once so bold as to admit his ledger crimes, now shuffled through the cloister with his eyes downcast, muttering about proper inventory procedures. Only you remained unrepentant, mostly because the wine's warmth still lingered in your bones, like an uninvited but surprisingly pleasant guest. Then the abbot summoned you. His study smelled of beeswax and barely restrained fury. The ledger lay open on his desk, its pages filled with Brother Cellarer's meticulous script, now amended in several places with a hasty pen. The abbot's fingers drummed against the wood. "You," he said, "are a menace." You opened your mouth to protest, but he continued. "You drank a barrel of sacred wine. You incited a rebellion. You made Brother Elias dance." His shudder suggested this last offense was perhaps the gravest of all. You considered your options. Denial seemed pointless. Defiance might earn you extra penance. Inspiration struck somewhere in between. It was for the good of the monastery, you said. The abbot's eyebrow arched. The egody. You said yourself the vow was outdated. And the wine, well, it clearly had clarifying properties. The abbot exhaled sharply, a sound like a bellows collapsing. For a moment you thought he might laugh. Then his expression hardened. "Your penance," he declared, "is to brew a new batch of sacred wine." Your shoulders sagged in relief. Compared to scrubbing floors or copying scriptures, this seemed almost merciful. Then he added, "From scratch." Your relief evaporated. In a week. Now it curdled entirely. "The feast of St. Drogo is upon us," the abbot continued, "and I will not explain to the bishop why we have nothing to serve but water and regret." He slid a yellowed parchment across the desk. The ink was faded, the script spidery with age. The original recipe. You scanned the ingredients. Grapes, of course. Honey, tutte. A dozen herbs you'd never heard of. And one final notation that made your stomach clench. ATTO, be blessed by a bishop during a waning moon. You looked up. "This is impossible." The abbot smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "Then you'd best get started." The first hurdle was the grapes. The monastery's vineyard had been neglected for years, its vines choked by weeds and the apathy of monks who preferred their wine ready-made. You spent an entire day clearing the worst of the growth, your back protesting with every tug. The grapes that remained were small, sour, and suspiciously fuzzy. Brother Anselm peered over your shoulder. "They look holy." You plucked one and bit into it. Your face contorted. "They taste like despair." The second hurdle was the honey. The monastery's bees, perhaps sensing your desperation, had become uncharacteristically uncooperative. Your first attempt to harvest their comb ended with you fleeing the apiary, your habit flapping like a sail in a gale as an angry swarm pursued you all the way to the fish pond. Brother Elias, observing from a safe distance, offered the first useful suggestion of his life, maybe bribed them. It worked. The bees, placated by a saucer of apricot jam, courtesy of Brother Cellar's now public stash, allowed you just enough honey to fill a small jar. The herbs were another matter entirely. Half grew only on the northern slope of the abbey's grounds, a place rumored to be haunted by the ghost of Brother Morris, the same monk whose terrible singing had inspired the vow of silence centuries before. And the silence centuries before. You found the patch at dusk, the plants glowing faintly in the twilight. As you bent to gather them, a gust of wind sighed through the grass. It sounded unmistakably like a poorly tuned hymn. You ran. By the sixth day, you had managed to assemble most of the ingredients. The mixture bubbled in a borrowed cauldron, its smell equal parts promising and alarming. Only one task remained, the blessing. The bishop, alas, was unavailable. "He's visiting the Carthusians," Brother Cellar reported. Something about their vow of silence being properly enforced. You stared at the cauldron. The feast of St. Drogo was tomorrow. The moon was waning, and the only clergyman available was the abbot, you realized. Brother Thaddeus, who had been dozing nearby, cracked one eye open. He is an ordained priest, and he's certainly grumpy enough to channel divine wrath. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. The abbot, when presented with this solution, looked as though he had bitten into one of your grapes. Still, he acquiesced, with conditions. "You will bottle it, you will serve it, and you," he said, pointing a finger at your chest, "will not I drink any of it." You nodded solemnly. The blessing itself was a subdued affair. The abbot circled the cauldron, his chant punctuated by the occasional suspicious sniff. The monks watched in silence, their faces a mix of hope and trepidation. Even the goats had gathered at the edge of the garden, their chewing momentarily still. When it was done, the abbot ladled the wine into a single flask and handed it to you. "For tomorrow," he said. Then, lower, "If this kills the bishop, I'm blaming you." The feast of St. Drogo dawned bright and clear. The monastery was decked in its finest, if slightly moth-eaten, banners. The bishop arrived in a cloud of incense and self-importance. And the wine. The wine was drinkable. The bishop sipped, paused, then sipped again. "Unusual," he pronounced. The abbot shot you a look that could have curdled milk. Then the bishop took another sip. And another. By the time he reached the bottom of his cup, he was smiling. "Almost inspired." You exhaled. The feast continued. The wine flowed, in strictly moderated portions, and for the first time in living memory, no one mentioned the vow of silence. Later, as you cleared the tables, the abbot approached. He studied you for a long moment, then reached into his robe and produced a second flask, smaller, unmarked, and unmistakably filled with your brew. "Hide this," he said, "and next time whiskey before you raid the cellar." You took the flask, the weight of it solid in your hand. Somewhere in the monastery, a goat bleated. Brother Elias dropped a platter. The familiar rhythms of monastic life resumed. And if the wine in your flask happened to taste faintly of rebellion, well, that was between you and the grapes. Chapter 11. The Grape Pilgrimage. The abbot's command had been clear: find better grapes. The monastery's pathetic vines would never produce enough fruit for a proper batch of sacred wine, and the feast of St. Drogo had proven, much to everyone's surprise, especially yours, that your brewing skills were not entirely disastrous. Thus, with a borrowed donkey and a list of instructions longer than the Book of Psalms, you were sent to the nearest vineyard. The journey took 2 days, during which the donkey proved to be both your greatest ally and most vocal critic. It carried your supplies without complaint, but took every opportunity to pause suddenly, forcing you to stumble into its flank while it regarded you with what could only be described as judgmental chewing. The vineyard, when you finally reached it, was nothing like the monastery's sad patch of weeds. Rows of lush vines stretched across the hillside, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. The air smelled of earth and fruit, and the faint, tantalizing hint of fermentation. A wooden sign, slightly crooked, declared, "Onde vino veritas. I sendi. Und etendis finden. You had barely tied the donkey to the post when the vintner appeared. He was a barrel-chested man with forearms like knotted rope, and a nose that suggested decades of enthusiastic sampling. His eyebrows lifted at the sight of your robes. "A monk," he said. His voice was rough as gravel. "Come to bless the grapes or drink them?" You straightened your habit. "I'm here to purchase." "Purchase?" He laughed, a sound like a cask rolling downhill. "Monks don't purchase. They barter or beg." His eyes gleamed. "Or taste." You hesitated. The abbot's warnings echoed in your mind. The dangers of the road, the temptations of the world, the particular sin of accepting hospitality from men who clearly enjoyed their work too much. But the sun was hot, the donkey was glaring, and the vintner was already steering you toward a shaded trellis where a dozen bottles glinted in the dappled light. "You want the muscat," he said, pouring a generous splash into a clay cup. "Sweet as a hymn, but with a kick like a mule." The first sip was a revelation. The monastery's wine, even at its best, had been a solemn affair, a drink for meditation, not celebration. This was liquid joy, bright and unapologetic. You couldn't suppress a smile. The vintner grinned. "See? God made grapes, but man made this?" He refilled your cup. "Tell me, brother, why does a monk need grapes when he could just buy the wine ready-made?" You explained your task, omitting the part where you had single-handedly drained a barrel of sacred vintage. The vintner listened, his expression shifting from amusement to something dangerously close to interest. "So you're the brewer," he mused. He leaned closer, his breath warm with the scent of last year's harvest. "Tell me, what's in this sacred wine of yours?" You recited the recipe's herbs, omitting only the blessing. His nose wrinkled at the more obscure ingredients. "Rosemary, fennel, no wonder you lot are so dour. Here." He pushed a different bottle toward you. "Try this. Blackberry and a touch of oak makes a man reconsider his vows." The wine was dark as sin and twice as smooth. It tasted of summer nights and poor decisions. You drained the cup without meaning to. The vintner's grin widened. "I'll make you a deal. Take my grapes, the best on the hill, and I'll throw in a barrel of last year's pressing for private study." The donkey, as if sensing your weakening resolve, chose that moment to bray loudly. The vintner ignored it. "You're not the first monk to come down this road," he said, topping up your cup again. "Brothers from St. Aurelius stop every year. Always leave with a little extra for the journey." His wink was as subtle as a hammer blow. The wine hummed in your veins, warm and conspiratorial. The abbot's warnings felt very far away. You woke at dawn, sprawled beneath the trellis, your head pounding in time with the donkey's impatient stomping. Your robe was stained purple at the hem. The vintner was nowhere to be seen, but beside you sat two crates, one filled with pristine grapes, the other with a small but unmistakable barrel. Teeped to its tap was a note. "I for scholarly purposes." The donkey's sigh as you loaded the crates onto its back was the most eloquent critique of your life choices yet. The journey back was slower, the donkey's steps careful under the added weight. You walked beside it, the barrel's presence a constant tempting weight at the edge of your vision. The vintner's words echoed in your aching head. "Makes a man reconsider his vows." And you exist. Ahead, the monastery's spire rose against the sky. Somewhere within, the abbot waited. You patted the barrel, then adjusted your robes. Shoulderly purposes indeed. Chapter 12. The Recipe of the Ancients. The grapes from the vintner were perfect, plump, fragrant, and untouched by the mold or existential despair that had plagued the monastery's own crop. Even Brother Anselm, who viewed all earthly delights with suspicion, had to admit they looked marginally less heretical than expected. The barrel, however, posed a problem. You had hidden it beneath a pile of old sackcloth in the brewhouse, but its presence seemed to radiate guilt like heat from a baker's oven. Every time you passed by, you could swear it emitted a faint, beckoning hum. You took to giving it a wide berth, which only made the donkey snort in what sounded like derision. But the real challenge lay in the recipe. The ancient parchment the abbot had given you was brittle with age, its ink faded to faint brown smudges. The Latin was dense with abbreviations and script, so cramped it looked as though the scribe had been writing in a hurry, or possibly mid-hallucination. You squinted at the words, your grasp of monastic Latin failing you at crucial moments. Take ye the fruit of the vine, something, 3 measures of... Was that honey or hemlock? Is. Brother Thaddeus, when consulted, peered at the parchment for a long moment before declaring, "Ah, yes, the sacred wine recipe, or possibly a shopping list. Hard to say." He tapped one particularly suspicious line. This could either mean bless under a waning moon, or stir counterclockwise until the abbot stops looking. This was not helpful. You tried Brother Cellar next, hoping his ledger-keeping precision might extend to ancient texts. He frowned at the parchment, then at you, then back at the parchment. You realize this calls for Eye of Newt, don't you? You blanched. It does not. He pointed. Right there. Oculum tritoni. That could mean anything. It could, he agreed. But do you really want to risk skipping it? You looked down at the recipe, then at the gleaming grapes, then at the suspiciously quiet barrel in the corner. A thought occurred, one so blasphemous it would have sent the abbot into spasms. What if you didn't follow the recipe at all? The monks who had written this had lived centuries ago. Their tastes were not your tastes. Their grapes had probably been better. And if Brother Thaddeus' stories were to be believed, they had also believed in things like balancing humors and not bathing during Lent. You rolled up the parchment and set it aside. The vintner's words floated back to you. God made grapes, but man made this. Ganin. No. You began to crush the grapes with a fervor that was either wholly or slightly unhinged. The juice ran dark and sweet, staining your hands purple. You added honey, generously. You tossed in herbs from the monastery garden, sniffing each one first to judge its merit. Rosemary? Yes. Fennel? Why not? A handful of mint leaves you found growing near the well? In they went. Brother Elias, drawn by the noise, hovered in the doorway. Is this allowed? You wiped your brow, leaving a purple streak. Do you want drinkable wine or not? He considered this, then grabbed a spare bucket and began stomping grapes with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered a loophole in the vow of obedience. By nightfall, the mixture was bubbling merrily in its vat, its scent rich and promising. You had just begun to relax when the abbot appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. His gaze swept the room. The discarded herbs, the stained floor, the pile of grape skins in the corner that somehow resembled Brother Morris' face. Then he looked at you. You strayed from the recipe. It was not a question. You wiped your hands on your habit. The recipe was unclear. Unclear. And possibly cursed. The abbot stepped closer, peering into the vat. The liquid within was a deep, opaque purple, swirling slightly as though alive. He inhaled. His eyebrows did something complicated. You added mint. It was growing nearby. And Is that blackberry? Your stomach dropped. The vintner's barrel sat innocently in the corner, its tap gleaming. The abbot followed your gaze. His expression did not change, but something in his posture suggested you were now treading water in very deep, very hot water. Then he did the last thing you expected. He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound like a cork popping, but it was unmistakably laughter. He shook his head, reached into the vat and dipped a single finger into the brew. He tasted it. His eyes widened. Then, very deliberately, he turned to Brother Elias. Fetch the others. The feast of St. Drogo that year was unlike any before. The wine, your wine, flowed freely. The bishop, upon tasting it, declared it surprisingly lively before dozing off in the refectory corner. Brother Elias recited an entire psalm backward without realizing it. Even Brother Anselm was seen smiling, though this may have been due to the bee that had gotten into his sleeve. As for you, you sat at the edge of the celebration, watching the monks laugh and debate, and in one memorable case, attempt to teach a goat to waltz. The abbot approached, his own cup in hand. You were right, he said, his voice low. The recipe was cursed. He sipped. This is better. You clinked your cup against his, the sound ringing clear through the torchlit night. Somewhere in the distance, the donkey brayed. The wine, it turned out, was sacred after all. Chapter 13. A miracle or a mistake. The morning after the feast, the monastery moved with the sluggish energy of men who had danced with goats and lived to regret it. Brother Elias was discovered curled around a rain barrel, murmuring apologies to his spoon. Brother Anselm sat very still in the cloister garden, his face pale as he stared at a bee that may or may not have still been in his sleeve. Even the abbot walked with the careful gait of a man trying not to disturb the delicate balance of his own skull. Only you felt strangely clear-headed, a fact that troubled you more than any hangover could have. Then Brother Cellar burst into the refectory, his eyes wide, his habit disheveled. The wine, he gasped. It's luminous, cried the A beat of silence. The abbot lowered his bread. Explain. Brother Cellar could not. He could only gesture wildly toward the cellar. The wine, when you saw it, was indeed glowing. The vat sat in the dim cellar, its contents emitting a soft golden light that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. It was beautiful. It was impossible. It was, you realized with dawning horror, your fault. The monks gathered around the vat, their faces bathed in its unearthly glow. Brother Thaddeus poked it with a spoon. The liquid rippled, sending shimmering reflections dancing across the ceiling. A miracle, whispered Brother Anselm. Or mold, muttered Brother Elias. The abbot turned to you. His expression was unreadable in the golden light. What, he said slowly, did you put in this wine? You racked your brain. Grapes, yes. Honey, certainly. Herbs, mostly the usual ones, though you might have gotten the rosemary and rue confused. The blackberries from the vintner's barrel, obviously. And then there was that incident with the bees. You cleared your throat. There may have been some accidental apiculture. The abbot's eyebrow arched. The bees got into the must, you admitted. Just for a moment, they seemed very interested. Brother Cellar made a noise like a deflating bellows. Holy bees, that explains the glow. It does? Of course not, he snapped. Nothing explains the glow. A debate erupted. Brother Anselm insisted the light was divine, a sign that your unorthodox methods had been blessed. Brother Elias countered that it was clearly witchcraft and possibly contagious. Brother Thaddeus, ever practical, suggested bottling it immediately and charging pilgrims to see it. Through it all, the wine pulsed softly, indifferent to the chaos it had caused. You reached out, dipped a finger into the liquid, and tasted it. The effect was immediate. Your tongue tingled. Your vision sharpened. The cellar, previously dim, now appeared in perfect clarity. You could count every cobweb, every groove in the barrels, every speck of dust on Brother Elias' nose. Then the visions started. Not the hazy, wine-fueled visions of before. These were crisp and bright, flashing behind your eyes like pages of a illuminated manuscript. A vineyard under a double rainbow. The vintner laughing beneath a starry sky. The abbot, years younger, sneaking a sip from the very same sacred cask you'd later drain. You blinked. The images faded, but the clarity remained. The monk stared at you. You stared back. "It's good," you said weakly. The abbot exhaled. Then, with the air of a man accepting his fate, he reached for a cup. The effects were varied. Brother Anselm spent the next hour weeping over the beauty of a particularly symmetrical turnip. Brother Elias became convinced he could speak to the goats, and was deeply offended by what they had to say. Brother Cellar, to everyone's shock, began reciting poetry, badly but with great feeling. As for the abbot, he sat quietly in his chair, watching the chaos with an expression of dawning wonder. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "We'll need more grapes." The donkey, when informed of this, brayed loudly enough to shake dust from the rafters. You patted its neck, your head still buzzing with visions and your heart light with something dangerously like hope. The wine was impossible. The monastery would never be the same. And you, Brother Theodoric, had somehow become a brewer of miracles. The donkey sighed. You couldn't blame it. This was going to be interesting. Chapter 14. The Feast of Fools. The Feast of St. Drogo had always been a somber affair, a day of quiet reflection on the life of a saint best known for his ability to frown through even the most joyous occasions. The monks would file into the refectory, eat their meal in near silence, and perhaps indulge in a single carefully measured cup of the monastery's oldest vintage. It was tradition. It was decorum. It was about to be thoroughly upended. The glowing wine had been decanted into the monastery's finest vessels, its golden light shimmering through the glass like captured sunlight. The abbot had insisted on strict rationing, no more than half a cup per brother, but as the servers moved through the hall, the portions seemed to grow mysteriously larger with each pour. By the time the first course arrived, the atmosphere had already shifted. Brother Anselm, normally so reserved, was explaining to his spoon the theological implications of honey fermentation. Brother Elias had abandoned his seat entirely, and was attempting to commune with a particularly receptive loaf of bread. Even Brother Cellar's usually impeccable ledger had been repurposed as a surface for an impromptu sketch of what appeared to be the abbot riding a goat. You kept your head down, nursing your own cup, watching as the feast unraveled with growing fascination and dread. Then the abbot stood. A hush fell, or at least what passed for a hush in a room full of mildly intoxicated monks. The abbot cleared his throat, his face grave. "Brothers," he began, "today we honor St. Drogo, a man of great piety and—" He paused, his brow furrowing. "Actually, now that I think on it, the man was a bit of a bore, wasn't he?" The room froze. A giggle escaped from somewhere near the back. Brother Thaddeus, whose expression immediately shifted to horror at his own transgression. The abbot's head snapped toward him. The monks held their breath. Then the abbot laughed. It started as a snort, then grew into a full-bodied chuckle that shook his shoulders. The sound was so unexpected, so utterly at odds with years of solemn tradition, that for a moment the entire monastery seemed to teeter on the edge of disbelief. Then the dam broke. Brother Elias let out a whoop and flung his bread into the air. Brother Anselm began singing, badly but with great enthusiasm, a hymn that had not been approved by any liturgical authority. The goats, sensing an opportunity, made their way into the hall and began investigating the table linens with professional interest. Through it all the wine glowed, its light dancing across the walls like a living thing. You watched, equal parts awed and terrified, as centuries of monastic decorum crumbled in the span of a single evening. The abbot, now holding court at the head table, was regaling a group of wide-eyed novices with a decidedly unflattering story about Brother Morris' singing voice. Brother Cellar had given up on his ledger entirely, and was attempting to teach a goat to balance a spoon on its nose. Even the bishop, who had been invited as an honored guest, was nodding along to a tune being played on a set of improvised reed pipes, though given his expression he might simply have been too stunned to protest. Then the abbot's gaze met yours across the hall. His laughter faded, replaced by a look of dawning horror. The same realization struck you both at once. This was not just a feast. This was a revolution. The abbot stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The room fell quiet again, the merriment pausing mid-breath. "Brothers," he said, his voice strained. "Perhaps moderation." His words trailed off as Brother Elias, in a moment of either divine inspiration or profound confusion, crowned him with a wreath of grapevines. The abbot reached up, touched the leaves. The shock of everyone present began to laugh again. The feast lasted well into the night. The wine flowed. The goats feasted. The walls, long accustomed to whispers and solemn chants, echoed with laughter for the first time in living memory. And you, Brother Theodoric, sat in the midst of it all, your cup glowing gently in your hands, wondering what in God's name you had unleashed. The donkey, when you finally stumbled out into the cool night air, gave you a look that spoke volumes. You patted its nose. Tomorrow would bring penance. Tomorrow would bring consequences. But tonight had been a miracle. Chapter 15. The Divine Hangover. Dawn came not with the gentle light of God's grace, but with the subtlety of a hammer to the skull. The bell for prime rang with what could only be described as malicious enthusiasm, each toll sending fresh waves of agony through your head. You peeled your face from the refectory table, where you had apparently collapsed sometime during Brother Elias' interpretive dance, and immediately regretted it. The monastery was a ruin. Grape-stained robes lay discarded like fallen banners. The goats had apparently held some sort of council in the night, judging by the overturned chairs and the suspicious hoofprints on the abbot's ledger. Brother Anselm was curled around a rain barrel, murmuring apologies to a clump of rosemary. Brother Cellar lay sprawled near the hearth, his face smudged with charcoal from what appeared to have been an ill-advised attempt at beard-based calligraphy. And the wine, the blessed, cursed, glowing wine, was gone. Every last drop. You groaned and pressed your palms to your temples, as if you could physically hold in the memories of last night. The abbot laughing. The bishop attempting to juggle turnips. Brother Elias' heartfelt declaration that the goats were clearly the most enlightened beings in the monastery, and should henceforth lead morning prayers. The abbot. The thought struck you like a bolt of divine retribution. Where wasn't the abbot? The answer came in the form of a low, pained moan from the direction of the cloister. You stumbled toward the sound, your sandals sticking slightly to the wine-splashed stones. Abbot Jerome sat on the edge of the well, his face a masterpiece of suffering. His robes were rumpled, his hair stuck up at improbable angles, and the grapevine wreath still perched drunkenly atop his head. He cradled a cup of water in both hands, as though it were the only thing tethering him to this mortal plane. He looked up as you approached. His gaze was bloodshot, but clear. Clear enough, at least, to convey the depth of his displeasure. You opened your mouth to speak, but he raised a trembling hand. "Don Tutti." You didn't. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant bleating of goats and Brother Elias of faint sobs from somewhere near the apiary. Finally, the abbot sighed. "The wine." You winced. Was it supposed to? He gestured vaguely at his own head, then at the wreckage of the cloister. You shook your head, then immediately regretted it as your vision swam. "I thought it would just a little." The abbot's expression suggested he was rapidly calculating how many years of penance it would take to erase this from monastic history. Then, to your shock, he snorted, "It was a good vintage." You blinked. The abbot took a careful sip of water. "Not holy, perhaps, but good." He eyed you. "We'll need more." Your heart, which had been lodged somewhere near your sandals, dared to lift. "More? Next year's feast won't plan itself." He stood, wincing as the motion clearly disagreed with him. "And Brother Theodoric?" "Yes, Father Abbot. Next time, perhaps less, whatever caused the interpretive dance." You nodded solemnly. As the abbot shuffled away, his steps slow but steady, you allowed yourself a small, cautious smile. The wine had been a disaster. A miracle. A mistake. A revelation. And, God help you all, there would be more. The donkey, when you finally stumbled back to the stable, regarded you with something dangerously close to respect. You patted its nose, then immediately had to grab the wall for support as your head protested the motion. Somewhere in the distance, a goat belched. It was going to be a long year. Chapter 16. The bishop's visit. Word traveled faster than a monk fleeing a leech-blighted bath day. Within a fortnight, reports of the miracle wine had spread to every parish, abbey, and roadside tavern between the monastery and the bishop's residence. Pilgrims began appearing at the gates, begging for just a glimpse of the glowing liquid that had inspired such holy joy. The dancing goats having been somewhat exaggerated in the retelling. The abbot handled these requests with surprising diplomacy, mostly by claiming the vintage had been exhausted through pious contemplation, but there was no putting off the bishop himself. His arrival was heralded by a cloud of dust and the panic bleating of goats being hastily ushered out of sight. The bishop's carriage rolled into the courtyard with all the subtlety of a siege engine, its gilded trim glinting ominously in the sunlight. You had been preparing for this moment since the last grape-stained robe had been scrubbed clean. The abbot's instructions had been explicit. Explain the wine. Do not mention the original barrel. And for the love of St. Drogo's unblinking eyes, keep Brother Elias away from the bishop. The bishop emerged from his carriage like a ship cresting a wave, his robes billowing, his expression that of a man bravely enduring an unpleasant but necessary duty. The abbot greeted him with a bow so deep you feared he might topple over. "Your Grace," the abbot intoned. "What an unexpected—" "Where is it?" The bishop's voice was sharp as a quill dipped in vinegar. The abbot blinked. "My lord, the wine. The miracle wine." The bishop's gaze swept the courtyard, lingering on the still slightly grape-stained cobbles. "I would see this phenomenon for myself." A hush fell. The other monks found sudden, intense interest in their sandals. The abbot's smile remained fixed, though his left eyelid had begun to twitch. Then his gaze landed on you. "Ah, Brother Theodoric, our humble vintner, will be delighted to explain." His tone suggested this delight would be immediate and absolute. You stepped forward, your mouth dry as last week's bread. The bishop's eyes, small, dark, and unsettlingly perceptive, locked onto yours. "Well?" You cleared your throat. It was divinely inspired. The bishop's eyebrow arched. "Inspired how?" "Through prayer and careful study of the monastery's ancient texts." You gestured vaguely toward the library, hoping he wouldn't ask which texts. The bishop's expression suggested he was well acquainted with the creative interpretation of ancient texts. "And this wine," it glowed. "Yes." "And caused visions?" You swallowed. "Clarity of thought, your grace. A deeper understanding of God's creation." The bishop's gaze sharpened. "And the dancing?" Behind you, Brother Elias made a small, strangled noise. "That," you said carefully, was likely a separate miracle. The bishop stared at you for a long moment. Then, to your horror, he smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "Show me the process." The tour that followed was the longest afternoon of your life. The bishop inspected the vineyard, now suspiciously lush, the cellar, still faintly glowing in places, and the bees, who seemed to recognize a kindred spirit and buzzed ominously. Through it all, you walked the razor's edge between truth and disaster, praising the wine's spiritual qualities while carefully omitting its more recreational effects. The bishop listened, nodded, and asked pointed questions that left you sweating despite the autumn chill. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the cloister walls, he turned to you and the abbot. "I will sample this wine." The abbot's breath caught. "Of course, your grace. Though I must warn you, it is quite potent." The bishop waved a hand. "I have sampled communion wine from every diocese in the province. I doubt your local vintage will surprise me." The abbot's expression suggested he very much hoped it would not. The wine was brought, a single, carefully measured cup, its glow muted in the daylight. The bishop raised it, sniffed, then took a sip. A beat of silence. Then his eyes widened. His grip on the cup tightened. He took another, longer sip. When he lowered the cup, his expression was unreadable. "Interesting," he. You dared to breathe. Then the bishop's gaze fixed on you. "Brother Theodoric, is it?" You nodded. "You will accompany me back to the diocese." The courtyard froze. The abbot's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The bishop continued, his voice smooth as aged wine. "His Holiness has expressed an interest in revitalizing the sacramental vintages of the region. Your expertise would be invaluable." It was an honor, a nightmare, a divine intervention, or a punishment. You couldn't tell which. The abbot found his voice at last. "Your Grace, Brother Theodoric, is dearly needed here. Our vineyards, you see, will survive a season without him." The bishop's smile was benign. His tone was not. "The Church requires his service." There was no refusing, not without admitting why you were really so indispensable. As the bishop turned away, already dictating instructions to his scribe, the abbot gripped your arm. His whisper was urgent. "Remember, the original barrel, the quantity consumed. These things are between you and God." You nodded, your mind racing. The donkey, when you went to pack your few belongings, regarded you with something akin to pity. You patted its nose. "At least the diocese has better grapes." The donkey snorted. You sighed. It was going to be a long winter. Chapter 17. The Test of Faith. The bishop's residence smelled of incense, old parchment, and the quiet terror of scribes who had learned not to make sudden movements. You had been given a tiny cell near the kitchens, close enough to smell the bishop's meals as they were prepared, but not so close as to actually receive any, and put to work immediately. The bishop's own vintner, a gaunt man named Brother Bertrand, who looked like he hadn't smiled since the last century, watched your every move with the intensity of a hawk eyeing a particularly slow mouse. Your task was simple in theory. Recreate the miracle wine under controlled conditions, using only the finest ingredients the diocese could provide. In practice, this meant spending your days elbow-deep in vats of grape so expensive. They probably each had their own confessor, while the bishop's scribes took notes on everything from the angle at which you stirred to the number of times you blinked per minute. On the third day, the bishop himself appeared in the winery, his robes swirling around him like a particularly judgmental cloud. He surveyed your work with a critical eye, pausing to sniff at the bubbling must with the air of a man who suspected it of heresy. "Well?" You wiped your hands on your already stained apron. "It's progressing, Your Grace." He arched a brow. "But will it glow?" That was the question, wasn't it? The monastery's wine had gained its peculiar properties through equal parts accident, desperation, and possibly divine intervention. Here, under the bishop's exacting gaze, with grapes that had never known a hungry goat or a lazy monk, the process felt sterile. You gestured to the vat. "Holiness cannot be rushed, Your Grace." The bishop's expression suggested he had heard that particular evasion before, usually from debtors. "We will test it tomorrow." Your stomach dropped. "Tomorrow?" "After morning prayers." He turned to leave, then paused. "The Archbishop will be joining us." Brother Bertrand made a small, strangled noise. You didn't blame him. That night, as you lay on your narrow pallet staring at the ceiling, you ran through every possible way the demonstration could go wrong. The wine might explode. It might turn vinegar. It might do nothing at all, revealing your miracle to be nothing more than poorly controlled fermentation and wishful thinking. Or worse, it might work exactly as it had at the monastery, in which case you would likely spend the rest of your days brewing sacramental wine under armed guard. Morning came too soon. The wine, when you uncovered it, looked fine. It smelled fine. It even tasted fine, insofar as you dared taste it under Brother Bertrand's watchful eye. But there was no glow, no divine luminescence. Just wine. Good wine, certainly. Possibly even great wine. But not miraculous. The demonstration was held in the bishop's private chapel, a space so ornate it made the monastery's altar look like a tree stump. The archbishop, a man whose beard alone seemed to weigh more than you did, sat in a carved chair that might as well have been a throne, while the bishop hovered at his elbow like an anxious falconer. You entered bearing a single flask, your steps echoing on the polished stone. The archbishop's gaze was heavy as a millstone. "Well, boy, let us see this marvel." You unstoppered the flask and poured. The wine flowed into the crystal cup, rich and red and utterly ordinary. No glow. No pulsing light. Just wine. A beat of silence. The bishop's face darkened. The archbishop sighed. Brother Bertrand began edging toward the door. Then, just as you were mentally composing your farewell letter to the monastery, a shaft of sunlight pierced the stained glass window above. It struck the cup, setting the wine ablaze with color. Not the golden glow of the original vintage, but a shimmering cascade of hues that danced across the archbishop's robes, like living stained glass. The effect lasted only a moment before the light shifted again, but it was enough. The archbishop's eyes widened. He reached for the cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Remarkable." The bishop exhaled sharply. "Indeed." You stared at the wine, then at the window, then back at the wine. It was a trick of the light, a happy accident, a miracle of timing and optics and sheer dumb luck. But the archbishop was already nodding sagely. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." You bowed your head, not trusting yourself to speak. The bishop clasped your shoulder, his grip just shy of painful. "Brother Theodoric, it seems your talents are even greater than we imagined." Brother Bertrand's expression suggested he strongly disagreed, but he wisely kept silent. As you left the chapel, the weight of your success settled over you. You had done it. You had recreated the impossible, or at least convinced the most powerful men in the diocese that you had. The donkey, when you returned to your cell, would no doubt have had some pithy observation about pride and falls, and the dangers of tempting fate. You sat on your pallet, staring at your wine-stained hands. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Chapter 18. The Unexpected Canonization. News of the miracle wine spread through the diocese with the speed of a tavern rumor. By week's end, pilgrims clustered at the bishop's gates, begging for even a drop of the blessed vintage. The archbishop, suddenly very interested in viticulture, announced plans to serve it at the next papal conclave. Brother Bertrand, who had spent the past 3 days muttering about optical illusions and cheap theatrics, was reassigned to copying tax records, a duty he accepted with the enthusiasm of a man walking to the gallows. And you, Brother Theodoric, found yourself the unlikely center of attention. The bishop summoned you to his study, a cavernous space lined with books that looked like they'd never been touched by human hands, and gestured to a chair with all the warmth of a man offering a seat on the rack. The archbishop was most impressed, he began, steepling his fingers. You nodded, your mouth dry. The Holy Father himself has expressed interest. Your stomach attempted to climb into your throat. The bishop leaned forward. This wine of yours, this each gift, must be shared, produced, perfected. His gaze sharpened. You understand what this means. You did, though you dearly wished you didn't. It meant vats. Endless vats. It meant years spent hunched over bubbling must while scribes recorded your every sigh. It meant never seeing the monastery's crooked vineyards or cantankerous goats again. It meant sainthood. The word hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but it hovered in the air between you, fat and improbable as a turnip in a communion wafer. The bishop's expression suggested he was already planning the iconography. Brother Theodoric holding a grape cluster, perhaps, or gazing beatifically at a conveniently glowing barrel. The absurdity of it all nearly choked you. You, a monk who had once screamed into a loaf of bread from sheer boredom, being venerated for an accident of fermentation and sunlight. The bishop mistook your silence for humility. Modesty becomes you, brother, but we must think of the church. He stood, his robes whispering against the floor. You will have whatever resources you require, within reason. You found your voice at last. And the monastery, your grace? His smile was thin. Your brothers will, of course, share in your triumph. The unspoken addition hung in the air, from a distance. That night, as you lay awake staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, the weight of your situation settled over you like a leaden cope. The wine wasn't holy. You weren't holy. The entire edifice of your newfound fame rested on a trick of light and the desperate need of powerful men to believe in something, anything, that wasn't the grinding tedium of their own bureaucracy. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled. You sighed. The donkey, had it been there, would no doubt have laughed itself hoarse. Morning brought a delegation of nervous novices, their arms laden with the finest grapes the diocese could provide. Behind them lurked a scribe, his quill already poised. You rolled up your sleeves and reached for the nearest bunch. The wine, at least, would be good. As for the rest, that was between you and God. Chapter 19. The New Duty. The bishop's letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, its wax seal pressed deep with the weight of ecclesiastical authority. You recognized the abbot's expression at once, the pinched look of a man caught between gratitude and dread. He cleared his throat, the parchment trembling slightly in his hands. Brother Theodoric, he began, by the grace of God and the bishop's infinite wisdom, you are hereby appointed the monastery's official vintner. A murmur rippled through the assembled brothers. Brother Elias dropped his spoon. Brother Anselm made a small, strangled noise that might have been envy or indigestion. The abbot continued, his voice carefully neutral. Your duties will include the cultivation of the vineyards, the production of sacramental wines, and... Here his eye twitched. Quality, control. The phrase hung in the air, ripe with implication. You bowed your head, hiding the traitorous smile tugging at your lips. Cellar, when you returned to it, seemed almost to welcome you back. The barrels stood in neat rows, their staves dark with age and the faintest patina of cobwebs. The air smelled of damp stone and forgotten possibilities. Brother Cellarer, hovering at your elbow, cleared his throat. The bishop was very specific about the quality control. You nodded solemnly. He suggested, Brother Cellarer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, daily sampling. You turned to him, eyebrows raised, to ensure consistency. He added quickly, you made a show of considering this, tapping your chin as if the idea had never occurred to you. A heavy burden, you mused, but one I must bear for the good of the monastery. Brother Cellar's answering smile was thin but knowing. The first tasting was, by necessity, a thorough affair. You sampled last year's vintage, tolerable, the current sacramental reserve, bland but serviceable, and the experimental batch you'd hidden behind the pickling jars, surprisingly lively. By the time the abbot found you, you were sitting on an upturned cask, contemplating the subtle notes of oak and poor decisions in your cup. He sighed. I trust your quality control is proceeding with appropriate solemnity. You raised the cup in silent salute. The abbot hesitated, then reached for a nearby tasting vessel. One cannot adequately supervise what one does not understand, he muttered, and poured himself a generous measure. The days settled into a rhythm as rich and mellow as the wine itself. Mornings in the vineyard, afternoons in the cellar, evenings spent recording your findings in a ledger that grew increasingly creative in its descriptions, hints of divine mischief, a finish reminiscent of Brother Elias' singing voice. The other monks, sensing a shift in the cosmic order, began to view you with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Even the goats seemed to regard you differently, their yellow eyes knowing as they watched you pass. Brother Thaddeus, as usual, saw to the heart of it. He found you one evening leaning against the garden wall, watching the sunset paint the cloister in gold and purple. So, he rasped, settling beside you with a creak of joints, they've made your sin into a sacrament. You sipped your wine, a new blend with just a touch of blackberry, and considered this. It's not a sin if it's your job. He cackled, the sound dry as old parchment. Tell that to the tax collectors. The stars emerged one by one above the monastery's steep roof. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated. You raised your cup to the darkening sky. The wine, as always, was excellent, and if your head pounded the next morning, well, that was between you and God's infinite mercy. Chapter 20. The Eternal Barrel. Years passed, as years tend to do, and the legend of the monastery's sacred wine grew far beyond its humble origins. Pilgrims arrived in droves, their eyes wide with reverence, their purses heavy with coin. They spoke of miracles attributed to a single sip, cripples walking, the blind seeing, sour marriages sweetened overnight. You listened to these tales with solemn nods, careful not to let your expression betray the truth. That the wine's most miraculous quality was how thoroughly it concealed the taste of Brother Anselm's cooking. The abbot, now comfortably ensconced in his role as keeper of the holy vintage, had developed a taste for showmanship. He conducted the tastings himself, his voice dropping to a hush as he described the wine's divine provenance. A phrase you noticed grew more elaborate with each retelling. The original barrel, long since emptied, had been gilded and placed in the chapel, where pilgrims could press their foreheads against its staves and whisper their prayers into the wood. You, meanwhile, had become something between a monk and a myth. Novices spoke of you in hushed tones, as if you might at any moment turn water into wine, instead of simply doing what you'd always done, fermenting grapes with varying degrees of success. The bishop sent regular missives requesting your presence at diocesan events, but the abbot, bless his unexpectedly cunning soul, had taken to replying that you were engaged in holy contemplation among the vines, a phrase that somehow always coincided with harvest season. The real work happened in the quiet hours, when the pilgrims had retired and the monastery settled into its ancient rhythm. That was when you slipped into the cellar, where a few select barrels sat tucked away from prying eyes. These were your private stock, batches too peculiar, too potent, or simply too good to share with the masses. Brother Cellar, your ever-willing accomplice, kept the keys and the ledger, his notations growing increasingly poetic with each passing year. Batch 23, one entry read, Notes of Summer Lightning and Questionable Life Choices. Reserve for personal use. It was during one of these late-night tastings that the abbot found you, his silhouette framed by the flickering torchlight. You braced for a lecture, but he merely sighed and held out his cup. "The pilgrims are getting worse," he grumbled, settling onto a cask with the weariness of a man who had spent the day convincing a wealthy merchant that no, the wine would not regrow his hair, though it might make him care less about its absence. You poured him a measure from the current year's reserve, a rich violet brew that shimmered faintly in the dim light. He sipped, grimaced, then sipped again. "This is terrible," he announced. You grinned. "Isn't it?" The abbot chuckled, the sound warm and unexpected. "We should serve this to the bishop next time he visits." You clinked your cup against his, the sound echoing through the cellar like a benediction. Outside, the stars wheeled over the monastery, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding below. The pilgrims would return in the morning, their faith undimmed by the mundane truth. The wine would flow, the legends would grow, and the monastery, once so quiet, so predictable, would thrive in its newfound notoriety. As for you, Brother Theodoric, you would continue your holy work, tasting, testing, and occasionally hiding the best bottles where only the right people could find them. The donkey, now old and improbably fat from stolen grape mash, brayed in the distance as if in agreement. You raised your cup to the sound and took another sip. The wine, as always, was perfect.